My sister-in-law's hands were shaking when she read the email, not from grief, from rage. And my husband, the man I'd spent 11 years building a life with, was standing in our kitchen doorway watching her, and he was smiling. That was the moment I understood everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because you need to understand how long this took. How much patience looks like weakness when you're the only one who knows what's really happening. My name is Fiona Marsh. I'm 32 years old, and until 8 months ago, I was married to my husband, Derek. We met when I was 21, in our second year at the University of Guelph. He was studying business administration. I was in accounting. He was funny and loud and completely sure of himself in that way that feels magnetic when you're young and still figuring out who you are. He made everything seem possible. He had this energy like the future was already his and he was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. We got married when I was 24. My mom cried at the reception. His mom made a speech about how Derek had finally found someone who could keep up with him. I thought that was a compliment. For the first few years, it was good. Not perfect, but genuinely good. We moved to Kitchener because housing was more manageable than Toronto. Derek started his business, a property staging and renovation consultancy, the kind of company that prepares homes for sale, decluttering, minor renos, furniture rental, the full package. It was a smart idea in a hot real estate market, and he had the personality to sell it. He needed someone to run the back end. Someone to handle vendor contracts, client invoicing, HST filings, payroll for the part-time crew. He needed me. I left my position at a mid-size accounting firm and came on full-time. We didn't call it a salary. We called it building something together. My mom's voice in the back of my head, she'd always told me to keep my own money, my own accounts, my own RRSP that nobody else's name was on, got a little quieter. I was 26. I was in love. I thought we were a team. For 5 years, I ran that business. Not helped run it. Ryan it. I handled every T4, every CRA correspondence, every vendor dispute, every subcontractor's invoice. Derek went to the client meetings, did the walkthroughs, gave the pitches. He was the face. I was the engine. At industry events, I was Derek's wife. When he won a regional small business award from the Waterloo Region Chamber of Commerce, his speech thanked his crew, his clients, his instincts. He looked right at me during that last part, and I actually felt proud. I was very good not noticing things back then. The first crack I remember was around our 7th anniversary. Small things. He started making decisions about the business without looping me in. New supplier contracts I'd find out about when the invoices arrived, a second van purchased on a line of credit I hadn't approved. When I asked about it, he said I was being controlling. That I needed to trust him. That he was the one with the vision and I was the one with the spreadsheets, and those were different jobs. I started sleeping badly. He hired a new project coordinator that fall. She was 24, very capable, very attentive to Derek's every opinion in the way that certain people are when they want something from someone. I noticed the way he talked about her. Too often, too casually, a little too eager to mention she'd laughed at something he said. I told myself I was being insecure. Then one night in February, it was a Tuesday I remember, because I always filed HST on Tuesdays, I was reconciling the Q4 accounts, and I found a line item that didn't belong. A monthly transfer, $3,000 going to a numbered company I didn't recognize. I dug back through the records. It had been running for 14 months. I almost called Derek right then. He was at a client dinner. I sat at my desk for 2 hours instead and kept pulling threads. The named company was registered in Ontario. The registered address was an apartment in Cambridge. The apartment was rented in Derek's name. 14 months of rent, utilities, furniture delivery receipts, all funneled through the business as contractor expenses. I went very still. I kept pulling what I found over the next 3 weeks, staying up until 2 in the morning, cross-referencing bank records, CRA filings, lender statements, was a picture I hadn't been close enough to see clearly before. The house we owned together in Kitchener had a mortgage of $480,000. Fine, we'd bought at the top of the market. That was expected. What I hadn't known was the HELOC he'd opened 18 months earlier, $150,000 drawn down, almost entirely spent. On what? Crypto. A trading account in his name alone, now worth approximately $4,200. Some of it on the apartment. Some on things I couldn't fully trace. Watches, a golf membership, a trip to Vegas that I had not been invited on and had not known existed. The business was worse. A $75,000 BDC loan, current. A $40,000 line of credit with TD, maxed. 2 supplier accounts and collections, amounts he'd apparently argued about and just stopped paying. CRA had sent 3 notices about unremitted payroll deductions. I had been signing those remittances. Or he thought I had. He'd been intercepting the paper mail. I sat in my kitchen at midnight with printouts spanned across the table, and I did the math. Total debts attached to our shared assets, approximately $780,000. Estimated value of those assets, maybe $650,000 if the house appraised generously. We were in a hole, and I had been doing the books. My first instinct was rage. Pure, clean, clarifying rage. I wanted to wake him up and put the printouts in his hands and watch his face. But I knew Derek. I'd watched him handle conflict for 11 years. He would cry. He would explain. He would make me feel guilty for snooping, guilty for not trusting him, guilty for reducing our marriage to numbers. He was very, very good at reframing situations until I was the problem. And there was something else. My mom had been insistent my whole adult life, not nagging, just steady and clear the way she was about most things. Keep something that's yours. She'd grown up watching her own mother lose everything in a bad divorce, and she'd made different choices. When I'd gotten married, she hadn't given me a gift registry item. She'd helped me open a separate TFSA, and she'd said, "This is not secret money. This is your money. There is a difference." Over the years, I'd added to it, not dramatically, but steadily. My own contributions from the early years at the accounting firm before I'd gone full-time with Derek's business, an inheritance from my grandmother, $95,000, left to me specifically with a letter in my grandmother's handwriting that said, "For Fiona, for her future, not for anyone else's." I'd kept it completely separate, never commingled it with our joint accounts, never used it for household expenses. My own financial advisor, my own statements, my own login. Between the TFSA, the inherited savings, and a small RRSP I'd maintained separately, I had roughly $210,000 that was legally entirely mine. I did not confront Derek, I protected myself instead. I contacted a family law lawyer in Waterloo. I found her through the Law Society of Ontario Referral Service, paid for the consultation myself in cash from my personal account. She reviewed my situation and told me exactly what I needed to hear. Inherited funds kept separate are generally protected as excluded property under Ontario family law. The TFSA contributions from before the marriage were similarly separate. If I could document everything clearly, I could walk away clean from the business debts. Then I set up a trust for my daughter. Lily was 8 at the time. She'd been born the year I came on full-time with Derek's business, and she was and is the most serious, observant child I have ever met. She noticed everything. She was also the reason I didn't do anything rash. I needed to make sure she was protected before I moved. I worked with a lawyer to establish a trust in Lily's name. The inherited funds went in. A portion of the TFSA contributions went in. My name was trustee. Derek's name was nowhere on it. It was for Lily's education, for a first home someday, for whatever she needed. It was untouchable. Then I documented everything. Every bank statement, every loan document, every CRA notice Derek had hidden from me. I kept copies at my mom's house in Burlington. I kept copies in a safety deposit box at a separate branch from where Derek and I banked. I saved everything on an encrypted external drive that lived in my mom's closet. And then I waited. I waited for almost 2 years. Derek left on his own schedule, which is what I'd expected. Men who build alternate lives rarely hold two things together indefinitely. Eventually, the weight of it collapses one side. He came home on a Saturday in March and sat me down at the kitchen table with the careful expression of someone who has rehearsed this moment. He wanted a divorce. He wanted the house. He wanted the business. He'd already spoken to a lawyer. He said, "Oh, this for Lily's sake." He said it with his hands folded, like he was presenting a business proposal. I looked at him for a long time. 11 years of marriage, the business I'd run from the ground up, the house I'd managed every detail of, our daughter's whole childhood. I said, "Okay." He blinked. He'd expected a fight. Any reasonable person would fight. I was entitled to equalization of net family property under the Family Law Act. I was entitled to half of the business value, a claim on the matrimonial home. My lawyer had laid all of it out. Instead, I said okay, quietly, with no emotion, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not guilt, relief, and underneath the relief, something more dangerous, arrogance. His sister arrived within a week. She and Derek had always been close. Too close, the kind of close where she had opinions about our grocery budget and knew details of our private conversations that I'd never told her. She came over while I was packing some personal items into boxes and stood in the hallway of my own house with her arms folded and told me I should have tried harder. "He's not a bad person," she said. "You just stopped making him feel appreciated." She'd said similar things for 11 years. I was used to it by then. I had excellent practice at letting her words move through me without leaving a mark. Within 2 weeks, Derek had moved his girlfriend in. She was 26, worked for a competing staging firm. That was how they'd met, apparently, at an industry event I hadn't attended because I'd been home with a sick Lily. She walked through my house like she was appraising it professionally, which I suppose she was. She rearranged the living room. She replaced the dining table I picked out with something from a warehouse store with visible MDF edges. She repainted the front door. I had spent weeks choosing that color, a deep, warm red, the kind that photographs well on a listing, which I knew because it was literally my job to know. She painted it black. Black. Like she had no imagination and no sense of irony. I moved into a rental in a quieter part of Kitchener with Lily. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a galley kitchen. Lily arranged her bookshelf the first night and declared the apartment cozier than the big house with the complete sincerity of an 8-year-old who was trying to make her mother feel better. I had to step into the bathroom for a minute after that. Meanwhile, I had one friend I believed was still mine. I'd known her since high school. We'd grown up together in Burlington, gone through university together. She'd been at my wedding. When Derek made the announcement, she was the first person I called. She listened for 2 hours. She told me he was an idiot. She told me I deserved better. She kept calling, kept showing up with coffee, kept asking how things were going, what my lawyer had said, what I was planning to do about the house. I started to notice things. Derek knew about decisions before I made them public. When I mentioned I was thinking about requesting a financial disclosure through my lawyer, Derek made a comment to Lily 2 days later about how the divorce was getting complicated because Mom wants to drag it out. When I told my friend I was looking at a specific rental area, Derek made a pointed comment about that neighborhood being outside my budget. I tested it. I told her something I'd made up, a detail about a mediator I wasn't actually pursuing. Derek referenced it within 4 days. The ache of it was different from Derek's betrayal, duller and deeper. 20 years of friendship, and she decided that access to my soon-to-be ex-husband's approval was worth more. I don't know what he'd offered her. I don't know if she even understood what she was doing, or if she'd convinced herself she was just being a friend to both of us. It doesn't really matter. I went quiet. I stopped sharing anything real. I gave her the performance instead. The version of me who was exhausted and defeated and just wanted it to be over. She carried that to Derek. He relaxed. Lily, meanwhile, was watching everything with those serious eyes of hers. She was 9 by then. She saw her dad's new girlfriend. She saw her grandmother, Derek's mom, being warm and helpful to the girlfriend in the kitchen while speaking to me in the careful, distant tone of someone who has written you off. She heard Derek tell her, more than once, that Mom was making things difficult, that he just wanted everyone to be okay, that she was the one slowing everything down. One night in my small kitchen, she looked up from her homework and said, "Dad says you're fighting over money." I said, "What do you think is happening?" She thought about it. "I think Dad doesn't know something you know." I looked at my 9-year-old and I squeezed her hand and I said, "Just wait a little bit longer, okay? I promise it will make sense." She went back to her homework. She trusted me. I did not take that lightly. My lawyer's name was Priya. Sharp, experienced, completely without sentimentality about family law after 15 years in practice. When I brought her the 3 binders of documentation, she read them over the course of a long meeting and then sat back and looked at me with an expression I recognized. The recalibration. "You've known about this for almost 2 years. I needed to make sure Lily was protected first. And you've kept the inherited funds and personal savings entirely separate, no commingling." My mother was very clear with me when I got married. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Under the Family Law Act, what you're proposing is legal. It's unusual. Most people fight for equalization, but it's legal. You're waiving your equalization claim voluntarily. In exchange, he takes all the assets, which means he takes all the encumbrances." She looked at the numbers again. "He's inheriting a net negative position." I said, "He asked for everything except Lily. I'd like to give him exactly what he asked for." Priya smiled. It was not a worm smile. It was the smile of someone who has spent 15 years watching people make expensive mistakes and is, just this once, watching the opposite. The strategy was exact. A standard separation agreement. Derek receives all marital property, the matrimonial home, the business and all its assets, both vehicles. I receive a modest lump sum settlement, personal belongings, and a shared parenting arrangement for Lily. Attached to the agreement was a schedule of encumbrances. Every mortgage, every HELOC balance, every business loan, every outstanding CRA remittance, every collection account. By signing for the assets, Derek was assuming sole liability for all of it. It was all disclosed. Every number was real. My lawyers were not hiding anything. Derek's debts, they simply hadn't been his alone until he signed. Derek's lawyer was a man named Sullivan, mid-50s, conservative, experienced. He called Priya 2 weeks before the final agreement to request a full financial audit of the business before signing. Derek refused. Sullivan told him, quite clearly and in writing, "I strongly recommend you commission an independent valuation of all assets and liabilities before executing this agreement." Derek wrote back that he built the business himself. He knew what it was worth, and he wasn't going to pay an accountant to tell him something he already knew. He signed a document acknowledging he was declining against his own counsel's advice. Sullivan had been practicing long enough to know when a client was about to make a catastrophic decision. He also knew he couldn't make Derek read his own documents. Derek had a new girlfriend who wanted it done. Derek had a sister who wanted me gone. Derek had spent 11 years not reading the fine print on things because that was my job. Some habits are very hard to break. The night before the final agreement was to be executed, Derek texted me, "I appreciate you not making this worse than it needed to be." I stared at that message for a while. 11 years. The business I'd kept alive while he made pitches and won awards and rented apartments for other women. The house I'd managed and decorated and repainted twice. Our daughter, who I'd held together through all of it. And he was thanking me for being compliant. I wrote back, "I just want what's best for Lily." I did. The trust fund, $210,000, safe, untouchable, growing. Her future secured. Whatever happened with the rest of it. The final meeting was at Sullivan's office, not a courtroom. In Ontario, uncontested separations often don't require a court appearance, just properly executed documents and independent legal advice certificates. I sat across from Derek with Priya beside me. Sullivan was across the table. Derek looked easy, settled, like a man collecting a check. He said everything quickly. He'd always been a fast signer, never a careful reader. 11 years of evidence supports this. Sullivan had organized the documents into sections: main agreement, asset schedule, parenting plan, my settlement terms, and then at the end, Schedule D, encumbrance and liability disclosure. I watched Sullivan's face as he did his final review. I watched him flip to Schedule D. I watched him read, then reread, then turn back a page. He leaned toward Derek and said something quiet. Derek waved him off. Sullivan said something else, more urgent this time. Derek looked at him, then at the paper, then at the numbers. The HELOC balance, $148,000. The BDC loan, $73,000 remaining. The TD line, $40,000. C arrears, payroll remittances, $38,000 plus penalties and interest. Supplier collections, $22,000. Total liabilities assumed, approximately $321,000 against assets, the business currently valued by Priya's independent assessment at $140,000, the house at approximately $510,000, with the existing first mortgage of $480,000, leaving roughly $30,000 equity before HELOC. Net value of everything Derek had just signed for, deeply, demonstrably negative. Derek stood up, his chair scraped back. He looked at me and his voice went sharp. You knew about this. Priya kept her voice very even. Everything in Schedule D was disclosed in our initial production. Your counsel received these figures 3 weeks ago. Sullivan said quietly, I advised a full review. Derek turned to him. You didn't tell me it was this bad. Sullivan said, I told you to hire an accountant. You have it in writing. Derek turned back to me. His face had gone through several things in the span of 30 seconds. Surprise, anger, something that might have been shame, and had settled on a kind of desperate recalculation. Fiona, come on, we can figure this out. We don't have to do this. I looked at him for a moment. This man I had loved since I was 21. This man who had rented an apartment in Cambridge for 14 months on money I tracked and remitted and filed quarterly, who had told our daughter more than once that I was the one making things difficult. You asked for everything except Lily, I said. I made sure you got exactly what you asked for. I picked up my copy of the executed agreement, and I walked out. In the parking lot, I could hear Derek's voice through the window, raised, insistent, cycling through the stages of a man who has realized the problem is not fixable. Sullivan's responses were steady, professional, the tone of someone who has learned not to absorb other people's emergencies. Priya walked beside me to my car. She said, in 15 years, I have never had a client who came to me more prepared. I said, my mom was very insistent about RRSPs. She laughed. I drove home. The collapse was faster than I'd expected and slower in some ways than I'd hoped. Within 3 weeks, Derek tried to refinance the house to cover the immediate CR arrears. The HELOC was already secured against it. No lender would touch it in the position it was in. The CRA doesn't wait. They sent a requirement to pay to his business bank account within 6 weeks of the notice becoming final. His girlfriend moved out quietly sometime in the 5th week. Lily came back from a weekend visit and mentioned, without particular drama, that the black door had been repainted again. I didn't ask who'd done it. The business lost 2 major clients when word got out about the CRA situation. In a market like Waterloo region, reputation travels fast, and real estate agents don't want to risk their transactions on a staging company with a lien situation. Derek tried to sell the client list. There weren't many takers. By month 4, his sister called me. She was not warm, but she was not hostile either. A middle register I hadn't heard from her before. She said she hadn't known how bad things were financially. She said Derek had told the family that I'd hidden assets and tricked him, but she'd spoken to Sullivan's assistant and gathered a clearer picture. She said, I think I owe you an apology. I said, I appreciate that. I didn't say anything else. Some relationships can be rebuilt on an honest foundation. Some can't. I haven't decided yet which kind this is. Lily figured it out the way she figured out most things. Slowly, methodically, by lining up what she'd observed against what she was gradually being told. One evening in October, about 2 months after the agreement was executed, she sat beside me on the couch in our small rental with her legs folded under her and said, "You protected me first, before you did anything else." I looked at her. That was the whole plan. The trust fund? Yes. She was quiet for a minute. Dad doesn't have that. No. But I do. You do. It's yours. For university, for a home someday, for whatever you need. No one can touch it. She leaned her head against my shoulder. She was 9 years old and already wiser than most of the adults in this story. I held on to that moment for a long time after. My settlement, the lump sum from the agreement, went toward the rental deposit, some furniture, and 6 months of breathing room while I rebuilt. I went back to accounting, part-time at first, then full-time with a small firm in Waterloo that focuses on small business clients. I know that world very well. Turns out that's worth something. I also started doing what I'd quietly wanted to do for years. Financial literacy workshops, evenings and weekends, through a women's center in Kitchener. Budgeting, separation finances, how the Family Law Act actually works, what RRSP contributions mean in a divorce context, what excluded property means, and why your grandmother's inheritance might be more protected than you think. The sessions fill up quickly. I've had women in their 50s come in who've never filed their own tax return. I'd had women in their 20s come in who are smarter about this than I was at their age, and I tell them so. My mom comes to some of the sessions. She sits in the back row with her arms folded and nods at everything. She doesn't say much. She doesn't have to. One evening, Derek showed up at my door. This was about 5 months after the agreement. He looked the way men look when the story they've been telling themselves runs out of road. Tired, smaller, a little confused about how he'd arrived here. He said he hadn't understood the full picture. He said he's made mistakes. He said, maybe we could talk, maybe there was something to figure out, maybe… He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't know how. I leaned against the doorframe and looked at him for a moment. This was the man I believed in since I was 21. The man who had stood at the front of a room and thanked his own instincts for something I'd built. The man who had looked at our daughter and told her I was making things difficult. You asked for everything except Lily, I said, and I made sure Lily is taken care of. There's nothing left to figure out. He stood on my doorstep for another minute or two. I watched through the peephole after I closed the door. Lily came down the hallway and stood beside me, and we both watched through that small circle of glass until he finally walked back to his car. She looked up at me after. I smiled at her. "Cozy apartment," I said. "The coziest," she agreed. She went back upstairs to finish her homework. I stood in my small front hallway, the one with the coat hooks I'd installed myself and the mat that said home in plain block letters because I'd chosen it and it was mine. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not victory, not even relief, exactly. Just stillness, the particular quiet of a life that is finally actually yours. My mom always said a woman should have her own money, not secret money. She was always clear about that, just hers, something no one could reach. She was right about everything. She usually is. There's a moment near the end of all of this that I keep coming back to. Not the signing, not Sullivan's face going pale. It's Lily, sitting at my secondhand kitchen table doing her homework, looking up at me and saying, "You protected me first, before you did anything else." That's the part that stays. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in this story. Not the legal strategy, not the numbers, but the deeper mechanics of it. Derek built something on borrowed time, borrowed money, and borrowed trust. He borrowed my labor for 11 years and called it a partnership. He borrowed against our home without telling me and called it vision. He borrowed from the future we were supposed to share and spent it on a life I wasn't part of. And then he was surprised when the accounting came due. That's how it works, I think. Not fate, not punishment in any mystical sense, just the plain, patient logic of cause and effect. What you build on a false foundation will eventually show you what it's made of. What I've come to understand is that the 3 years I spent waiting weren't passive. They were the most active years of my life. I was making choices every day to document, to protect, to stay clear-headed when I had every reason to act from hurt. That's not something that came easily. It required a kind of honesty with myself that I hadn't always practiced. I had to look at what was actually happening, not what I wished was happening. I had to stop explaining away the things I'd found in those late-night hours with the printout spread across the kitchen table. Seeing clearly when what you're seeing is painful. That's a discipline. I didn't know I had it until I needed it. And then there's the question of what you do with what you know. I could have confronted Derek the night I found the Cambridge apartment. I could have burned everything down from a place of shock and grief. Part of me wanted to, but I'd watched Derek operate long enough to know that an angry confrontation would have handed him control of the narrative. He would have cried. He would have explained. He was very good at making me feel like the problem. What I had to do instead was hold steady, stay in the situation, keep showing up, keep performing the role everyone expected while quietly building the structure that would actually protect my daughter. That kind of steadiness isn't coldness. It took everything I had. Every morning I had to decide, again, to hold the line. My mom gave me the most important piece of this before the whole story even started. Keep your own account. Know where your money is. Not because you distrust the person you're with, but because your financial security is not something you outsource to someone else's goodwill, no matter how much you love them. That's not cynicism. That's self-respect. Lily has a trust fund now because my grandmother believed that, and my mom believed that, and I listened. The inheritance passed through 3 women before it became my daughter's safety net. I find that worth thinking about. If I'm honest, I don't feel triumphant about any of it. What I feel is something quieter. I feel like I made a series of hard, careful decisions under a lot of pressure, and they worked out, and my daughter is okay. Lily is okay. She's doing her homework at my kitchen table, and she knows, in whatever way a 9-year-old knows things, that she was the priority, that her future was protected before anything else was decided. That's enough. That's more than enough. It's the only part that was ever really mine to get right.